Hi, this is Everyday Expertise, and I'm Angela, and I'm here today with painter Justin Donaldson. Hello.
Hello. How's it
He
going?
also, he also teaches painting through tutorials,
Yeah,
so
I
we're going to talk
do.
to him all that stuff today. So, just to start with, Justin, how did you get started in art?
Well, I've been doing art of some degree or another since I was a kid. I always drew and played music and danced when I was in high school. Um, but I ended up taking a year off after school to try and figure out what I wanted to do. And during that time period, I decided I either wanted to do music or art. Um, I went to school went to college for some music related things,
Mhm.
and that was all right. But I realized that didn't I didn't have the capacity to sit down and listen to really really loud music all day long, and it just drained me. So um, at the end of college, I met a woman who was from the United States, and I ended up following her here. And during that time, I had about a year where I wasn't allowed to work, just going through immigration
Mhm.
stuff.
Right.
And during that year, I decided I would just take that whole time to learn how to paint. And so I did. I learned how to paint, and um, from then on in, I was uh, just tried every single way about how to make a living from my art, and I failed greatly. For many many years, and
Mhm.
eventually slowly kind of just figured out how to actually make a bit of money and live doing what I love doing.
Mm.
So that's the overview.
Well, that makes sense. I'm sure a lot of people have started that way,
Yeah,
sort of just found how to monetize their art in a way.
yeah, it's not easy, not
Yeah,
easy at all.
definitely. So, what are your preferred mediums?
I like playing a little bit of everything, but probably I end up using a medium called poster color,
Mm-hmm.
or it's kind of a cousin to gouache. So either poster color or gouache most of the time. Probably second to that is open acrylics. Open acrylics are like normal acrylics, but they last longer.
Mm-hmm.
And so you end up having, it's really easy to clean them, really easy to sort of manage and take care of your workstation. You can kind of jump in and jump out of painting really fast. But you kind of have that um, ability to render and to take your time to make layers. All of the kind of things that oil really affords you. Open acrylics starts to be able to do the same thing. So it's kind of like where acrylics meets oil, and so
Hmm.
that's a really fun place to play. But I do spend most of my time in gouache and poster color.
Hmm. That's interesting.
Yeah.
What would you say are your major influences?
My major influences are all over the place. For a lot of my work these days, I take a lot of influence from some sort of traditional Japanese animation backgrounds.
Hmm.
Um, Kazuo Oga, a lot of the Studio Ghibli team. Um, that stuff is kind of at the forefront of what I really love doing. It's kind of about the emotions that it evokes,
Hmm.
right? So I'm not, there's a part of me that's kind of actually really resistant to associating myself with that. But essentially, my end goal, emotions wise, is kind of like exactly what I get when I'm watching one of those movies. And so there's a huge connection there that I'm happy to kind of associate myself with. Aside from that, um, I really love. There's a contemporary artist called Jeremy Lipking, who
Hmm.
is just amazing, an amazing oil painter. I spent a lot of my youth sort of looking at a lot of 17th century art as well, sort of the French Academy, William
Hmm.
Adolphe Bouguereau, and and then the Impressionists. So it's kind of this really strange mix of the French Academy, the Impressionists, um, Jeremy Lipking, and Miyazaki. Well, not actually Miyazaki himself, but
Mhm.
the Studio Ghibli team. Yeah,
Mm. Well, you do a lot of these really beautiful landscapes.
thank you.
Yeah. And you do. I believe you. I read on your site that you do plein air painting.
Yeah, plein
Yeah.
air painting.
What is
So
that, and what about it inspires you?
yeah, so plein air painting is just a fancy word for going outside and painting what I'm seeing. And I've struggled a lot with this idea of that artists should be good at every part of art, and if you're going to be a good artist, then you need to be really good at anatomy and basically really good at every single facet of art. And so I spent a lot of time focusing on a lot of different things. But I had a friend over recently, and we went painting together, and we were talking about this and talking about having this almost guilt that I really love painting landscapes and kind of neglect a lot of other things. And then we went out hiking, and we stood in front of a waterfall, and she said, "You know what? People don't make you feel this way. It's just standing out in front of a waterfall. People don't make you feel this way." And there's this feeling of standing in front of kind of any kind of amazing scene of nature that makes you feel, at the same time, small and insignificant, as well as kind of like a part of the whole thing. There's a sense of like awe and wonder, and um, almost like being a child and finding something amazing again. And so that's why I do what I do. I think that was a really good articulation of that. That's why I do what I do, because when I go outside and I find amazing landscapes and I find things that just intrigue me and fascinate me, it's um, there's a feeling I get from that. And I almost
Mm.
like the process of painting almost doesn't matter. The whole thing of being an artist, in some respects, I have to put that aside and be like, you know what? Art is communication, and I'm just communicating about something. If there's an author who is really good at writing, but the content of the writing is just like rubbish, then as an author, they're rubbish. And
Mm.
so it's been really hard to sort of think about that, but that's what it is. So like
Mm.
the content of my art, the fact that I got landscape painting and plein air painting, and is all because going out there makes me feel amazing, and it gives me peace, and it gives me this sense of um, childlike joy, and basically nothing else does.
Mhm.
Certainly, um, a lot of the things that people say make them feel connected don't make me feel connected, and so um, that's what I want to talk about, and not actually talk about, but
Mhm.
like communicate about. That's what my art is about.
Mhm.
And so I've grown more comfortable in being okay with that. I'm not an artist. I'm just a person who really appreciates that, and I have the capacity to communicate that. Um, yeah,
Well, I
that's
think that really makes sense with that you feel that you feel inspired by, say, the Impressionists,
yeah,
who had, I think, sort of that same kind of connection with emotion and nature and
yeah,
painting
definitely.
and communicating emotion through painting.
Yeah, there's definitely
Mm.
a lot. I think a lot of my influence from the art perspective, or from the perspective of like, do they look the same? No, but they feel the same, and
Yeah.
and that's what brings them all together. And that's why, like, honestly, I don't care what style I'm painting in, but like finding that thing that I care about, that I communicate about, is
Mhm.
that's the key.
Mm. Oh, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah,
Yeah. So, coming back to process, since this
yeah,
show is very much about process,
love
uh,
process.
can you walk me through yours? Say from idea to a finished painting.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's different every time.
Mhm.
Um, the major, I think the major tenet process is all about finding something that really fascinates me.
Mm.
That's kind of the first key of like there's this idea that you go out and you try and paint something cool, or like that's a good painting, or that might be a good painting. And a lot of the time, I find myself like going out to walk, and it's like someone says, "Oh, there's a really nice waterfall out there," and so I'll go out, and there's this part of my brain that's like, "You need to paint the waterfall because that's what's there. That's the really nice thing." But some part of me might be like looking down and find a really nice piece of moss, and I'm like, I don't care about the waterfall. Like, give me that moss. Um, and that's what I try and cultivate in myself, that sense of fascination and intrigue. And it's a very particular feeling inside of me. And it's hard to, it's easy to get distracted. It's hard to stay on track with that. But that actually just generally gives me a really good sense of focus,
Mhm.
um, of a focus for the process from the beginning. And once I get a hold of that, I almost need to say it out loud, otherwise I lose it. Like art is just there's so many skills involved and so much specs of process. You get lost in all of it. Like okay, this thing is about this piece of moss, and then suddenly you're getting to values and line and everything, the whole big picture and composition. And it's so easy to lose the sense that this is actually about that feeling, that little
Mm.
feeling that I have. Um, and so that dictates a lot of my process, and as such kind of the process changes depending on what can I do to best communicate whatever this thing is.
Mhm.
um, and so yeah, the I mean, if I were to go through, because I use a couple of different mediums, the
Mhm.
actual particular process is different every time. But if I were to, let's say with gouache, right? Gouache is
Mhm.
I normally wet the page, and wetting the page means that I can work on it for longer, so that it acts like oil for a longer period. I can make gradients and smooth things out. But you can't actually make really like intricate details with it, because you put
Mm.
it down and then it all just disperses immediately.
Oh, wow.
Um,
Yeah.
and so it forces. It's like using watercolor,
Mm.
and you wet everything, and then suddenly there's no detail. But doing that, working in that process most of the time means that I end up having to focus on the big picture,
Mm.
and the large shapes and the large blocks of color and everything. And so I find that's really helpful for me. Um, being someone who goes out and does plein air work also means that I basically have an hour and a half max
Mm.
for how the painting, to get to the end of that session, because by that time I'm an hour and a half in, the lighting has changed completely. Everything changes completely.
Mm.
Um, and again, it's a constraint that is really helpful, because it
Mm.
means that you have to do big, really big to small details, and you also have to know what your focus is. Otherwise, your painting's about nothing at the end of the day.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, I remember when I was first starting out, maybe about a year or two in, I started going to art crafts or art fairs, and um, I would set up with my oil paints, and I'd do a 45-minute speed portrait. So you'd sit down,
Mm.
and someone would sit down in front of you, and they'd pay $100 or something, and you'd paint your portrait for about 45 minutes.
Mhm.
And I learned through that process really quickly that you can't get stuck into the little details. And so I ended up adopting a process where you have to get everything. You kind of got to cover the whole page and get everything to a certain degree of finish, and then you can move on to the next degree of finish, and then you can move on to the next degree of finish, because like I'm not actually keeping track of time. I have something that says 45 minutes is over. um, but you just kind of get lost in everything, and so it basically had to be finished at every stage of the piece. um, and so between that and plein air work, there's kind of the sense of always bringing everything to the same degree of finish and then moving forward. Um,
Mhm.
Honing in on that point of interest and the point of that's really like captured that sense of feeling that you're going for. Um, so yeah, that's the overview of my process. Do you have any other more particular questions or thoughts about that?
So, would you say that you do any kind of do you do any sketching before you start really getting into the painting, or you just go straight with the paint?
I go straight to the paint unless it's heavily architectured.
Mm,
Unless I really need to pull in some heavy perspective. But generally, I'm eyeballing perspective, um, and I like to sit before I start. So it's not
mm,
just sitting down and starting. There's kind of a you kind of need to reason through, everything that's going to happen in the painting, and kind of in your head rehearse it. Um, Especially with water media, like there's time constraints with everything. So like, if I want a
mm.
gradient, that's good. That needs to happen at the beginning because it's not going to happen at the end. And if I want a soft transition, I really need to know when I'm going to do that. And if I
Mm,
have a hard transition, then basically everything else needs to be dry. And so kind of sitting and squinting and working through the values and kind of just getting a plan. And obviously the plan changes halfway through the painting most of the time. um, but yeah, I do a lot of uh, sitting and waiting. Otherwise I end up changing my mind halfway through a painting, and
mm.
that's never good.
And do you seal your paintings with any kind of product?
I do not.
Mm.
um, so gouache,
Is gouache fairly durable?
not particularly. But there's a problem. Gouache is really hard. Gouache is a matte medium,
Mm,
and so that means it kind of, if I put anything on it, it changes the property of the surface, which means that the
mm,
values will change, which isn't actually a negative, but it's a very different look. It ends up looking and feeling kind of like an oil painting.
mm,
Again, you can use that. You can use that to your advantage. But there's some kind of wax products that you use to seal things. They still change the values and the surface quality, and that's difficult. So mostly, I just the general recommendation is that
mhm,
you treat it like watercolor, where you don't really do anything at the end, but you seal it behind glass
mm,
when you frame it. Um, so there's that. When I'm using open acrylics, I actually really enjoy essentially painting a layer and then using a gloss medium on top of that, and then painting the next layer, and then
mm.
using a gloss medium on top of that. And you kind of build up, and you get a really nice finish. But that ends up, being completely different to gouache.
Mm,
Um, yeah, yeah. So most of my stuff ends up being inside of a book,
mm.
which is kind of really nice.
Well, that's pretty.
And it ends up, being very protective, right? So nothing's going to get in
Mhm.
here, nothing's going to destroy it,
That's good.
um, unless the whole thing gets wet.
Well, yes. All right. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, you also offer courses.
I
How
do.
did you get
Yeah.
into that? And what do these tutorials usually involve?
Yeah. So I spent some time working for a game studio, um, painting backgrounds. Well, at least I started painting backgrounds. By the time I was finished, I was coding all day. And so when that was done, I was like, okay, I'm just sort of finding my own way, and that's difficult when you look
Mhm.
at the actual kind of monetary return on freelance work. It's not great, and it's a really hard market. Um, and so I started doing freelance, and at some point realized that um, that there weren't that many people kind of teaching gouache or poster color or just teaching what it is exactly that I do. And so to spend some time sort of diversifying my income stream so I could
Mm,
try and get things to a livable level, I put out a couple of tutorials, and that was really nice. Just focusing on some of the things that I love, like foliage and painting water and painting rocks and all that kind of stuff. And that that was really good because it also forces me to actually sort of go back and think about why I do what I do, and I really enjoy that kind of introspective process. Um, and it's nice to be able to share that with people too. So I ended up doing that kind of these little hour and a half lessons, and that was really nice. And it ended up getting to a point where that was half of my income, and so getting things to a
mhm.
more livable level, that was really beneficial for me and my family. I've got a wife and two kids, and it was hard times there for a while,
Mm,
and so that was really good. And then I ended up. Now I was reading. I read a lot of business books. I read a lot of. I listen to a lot of business and marketing podcasts, just because, as an independent creator, I would love to just be able to sit down and paint all day, but we also have to make a living. And one of the things they suggested was that you really need to sit down and actually, have a look at what it is that you're doing and what's actually pulling in income. And at that time, I was doing conventions,
mm,
selling my art at conventions. I say selling my art at conventions, but I wasn't really selling my art at conventions. It wasn't going very well.
yeah.
And I ended up realizing when I sort of laid everything out, what am I doing? What's actually getting some degree of financial return? Um, all within the realms of things that I love doing and things that, I see myself as an artist doing and thriving and enjoying. So I'm not going out there and doing things just for money's sake.
Mhm,
I think for some people it's important to hear that, but one of the things I realized was, everything that I do that succeeds is about people.
hmm,
Everything that I do that fails is about an actual physical product that I'm selling people, because I don't enjoy physical products, to be honest. Like I'm not, I don't collect anything.
mm,
And um and so I think there's kind of an emotional philosophical problem, like a gap there that says, like, I'm trying to sell people a thing I don't care about.
mm,
And I care about the art. I don't care about the physical product. And so, it's hard to think about that. It's hard to sit there and just reason it out. But I realized everything I was doing that was actually succeeding was more about people.
mhm,
And and so then I sort of, I wanted to run with that. And so um, I ended up making some bigger courses that I'm not just, giving a video. I can have people come and join a community and talk through things, and where I'm communicating about a single idea. And so I have two courses
mm,
at the moment. One's a landscape painting course, and the other one's a gouache painting course. But running them and actually being inside of the community and helping people and giving direct feedback to people. So that's really good. I'd also like organize to start doing workshops and just things where I'm with
mhm.
people. You know,
That's
try
good.
and well, then COVID happened, so those aren't actually happening. Uh,
Well, now it'll just have to be all virtual.
yeah, for here and now, for here and now. But yeah, it's really interesting. It's interesting to it's interesting. It's also hard and difficult and freeing at the same time
Mhm,
to realize that as artists, there's no path.
mm.
There's no one thing to do that succeeds, and that sucks. But it's also really good. It means that, what, like, I don't have to do everything else everyone else is doing. I just need to look at what works for me and what works for my personality, and what works with what do people actually want, and kind of straddle that line in the middle there. Um, yeah, it's all very interesting.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So, what is something you wish you'd known about painting before you began?
Oh, honestly, what I just said in the context of actual painting itself, I spent
Mhm.
so long looking for the way to paint. The single path. A lot of, I think one of the artists that I first started um, really kind of following. His name is David LaFell. He's kind of a chiaroscuro classical artist, and I love his work, and I love most of the things that come out of his mouth. But he talks about he talks about the masters, and so it's
Mhm.
like the masters do this thing, and the
Mhm.
masters did that thing, and I have found the way of the masters, and so it kind of set me up for this like, all right, there's the way, there's the way to work, oh, the way to succeed, and I spent a long time chasing that, and I spent a long time. Yeah, I ended up going to a Portrait Society of America conference,
Mm.
and I sat there and I watched everyone. And there's these amazing artists. Some people I ended up having a chance of becoming a friend with eventually, and just getting to know, and that's been really cool. But what that taught me was like, man, every single one of these artists, they're doing this thing completely differently. Um, and that was disheartening as well as freeing. That was really nice. And so there's that. And along the same token, some of the things that have helped me emotionally and professionally, uh, along the same vein of that, as some of the things that we talked about at the beginning of like, I don't have to paint people. And there's I don't have to be the great artist who does
Mhm.
everything great. Um, I don't have to be Kim Jong Gi who can like draw everything all the time from imagination. Even though I still want that, I
Mhm.
still want all of these things. Um, but I'm no less of an artist because I don't do them,
Mm.
and that's really emotional. That's been really hard to like come to terms with. But the minute I came to terms with that was when everything turned around for me. Um, because then I was able to just chase the things that I wanted to, and I was able to stop looking at the waterfall and trying to paint the waterfall when I wanted to paint with the moss right down beside
Mhm.
me. Um, yeah, that was huge.
Mm. I think that's something that every artist has to sort of come to terms with
Yeah,
at some point, right? So that
yeah,
they can move on to sort of the next level of
yeah,
being an artist.
exactly. It was really hard for me to do that. Really hard. Um, I went through a mentorship with a couple of guys in the fantasy illustration industry,
Mm.
and it took a lot of them beating me over the head before I was able to see that. Um, they kept getting me to try and paint things that didn't involve people, and I was just like, well, a good painting has to have a person in it, so I put a person in it, but I didn't really care about the person, and only the backgrounds really ended up, having my love and attention. Um, and it took a long time for that to actually sink in that I
Mm.
didn't need to paint people.
So, how do you integrate your art into your daily life? How do you do sort of manage work life balance
With great
if you do?
difficulty. um, it's difficult. It's difficult. It's a little bit easier now. I recently have been privileged enough to be able to rent out a separate place from my home.
Mm-hmm.
Have a wife and two kids, and it was a big struggle
Mm.
in a moderate to small house to be able to paint when there's a kid screaming around everywhere and a lot of things happening. That's very difficult for me. I think it's probably more difficult for me than it is for most people because I'm
Mm-hmm.
a little neurotic. But yeah, yeah. And then lately, I've been really trying to allow myself to give responsibilities to other people.
Mm,
So like I could spend all day running running what I do as a business and never paint. But that's ridiculous because what I do is paint.
mhm,
And so there's basically two full-time jobs for me. Um, and neither of them work if I don't do the other. And it's kind of been the challenge of the year, of this year, is to give some things up to my wife,
mhm,
to hire somebody to help take care of some kind of marketing things and get somebody else to build my website.
mhm,
Um, Really, that's been the biggest, one of the biggest things, because it just doesn't happen on its own. And if I'm doing it, then I'm not painting.
mhm,
Um, and if I'm not doing it, then I'm also not making money. And unfortunately, we need that.
mm,
But otherwise, there's a really big. Since I moved into the new studio, there's been a sort of more difficulty. Before it was like whenever the kids are asleep and quiet, that's when I could work.
mhm,
Now I'm having to like renegotiate myself and relearn myself. I was like, when do I actually have energy?
mhm,
When do I have creativity? When am I able to like sit down and paint versus when is it best for me to do other things,
mhm,
all the other things on my list that I need to do. And that's been really difficult.
mm.
I haven't found a real good solution for that yet.
Oh, I'm sure
Open
you will.
open to suggestions if you have any.
I wish I could give I wish I could help you with that aspect. I mean, I have 9 to 5 job and this and other
Yes.
things I want to get to, and it's tough for everyone,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
it is. Again, I don't think there's a the way,
Yeah, that's true.
unfortunately.
There's no the way. There's
Well,
ways.
sometimes I find the way and then it changes.
Mhm. Yeah, it has to
I think I
change.
have like 3 or 4 months at a time where like at the beginning of the month I'm just trying to figure something out and look, it's working. Like I'm really in the groove of things. And then, you know, month two and a half, month three comes around and it's like, oh, that's not working anymore. Need to change that up.
Well, if you can find an adaptable way, that's probably the best thing, I guess.
Yes, something
Absolutely.
dynamic.
Mm. So, what would you say is your favorite aspect of art?
My favorite aspect of art. Um, that's a
Mm,
good question. A lot of it's that kind of emotive quality. A lot of it's mood. A lot of it is just the sense of, what? It's curiosity. I think that's what it is. That the question. I go into a lot of my pieces with a question, with like, what if I do this, or what if I want it to feel this way?
mhm,
And then I'm kind of driven by the answer to that question, driven to until I find the answer to that question. And then, with my next painting, trying to like, okay, so I found what makes it feel this way. How far can I push that? Like how far does this thing go? And then like I reach limits and then I, destroy paintings. And you're like, that didn't work at all. Like that's not how this thing goes.
mhm,
Um, Generally, I think I find when I'm in a groove and when things are going well, that's kind of how they're going well. And it's when I don't have a question, when I'm not curious, and I'm just knocking things out. That's when it's like, this is not, I don't know, not doing
mhm,
it for me. Um, so yeah, I think that's one of my favorite things about it, and the fact that I can actually I can make myself feel something. Or I can make other
mhm,
people feel something. That's really important to me. Um, and there's also this kind of like introspective quality to it.
mhm,
Most of us artists are loners and introspective and like, just leave me alone and let me do this thing and
mhm,
let me search something out. And a lot of the times it's a question, a lot of the times it's a mood. It's just I don't know, a lot of time introspecting, and I actually really enjoy that.
Mm. Do you have a least favorite? Something that frustrates you?
A least favorite, that it takes time. That's my least favorite thing. That it takes time. Um, that I need to be worried about business.
Mm.
That's one of my least favorite things. If someone else could just take care of all of that, or if it was at a point where it's like, you know what, whatever I do succeeds, monetarily, so I don't have to worry about monetarily, and now I just need to worry. Now I just get to worry about my questions and the moods and all that kind of stuff. Like that's not how it works. At least not for me. That's one of my least favorite things.
How do you cope with stress?
Poorly. No, I'm so bad at it. I'm so
Mm.
bad at stress, and I stress myself out so much. I always overload myself with work. But the way that I generally deal with it is I don't know what's happening until I'm a mess. Until I'm not sleeping and I'm eating terribly. I'm like stress eating and I'm gaining weight. Um, and then like, oh yeah, I'm stressed. And then and the hard part is that happens at stressful times. And so it's not like, oh, okay, well, let's just take a step back and let's just sleep and exercise. And, I know the things I need to do to get out of stress. Um, Especially when I was doing contract work, when I was just contract
Mm.
work all the time. I have a couple of contract pieces that I'm wrapping up. I'm coming to the close of right now, and this will probably be the last for a long time because they're stressful.
Mm.
Um, and but when you're in the point where you're getting stressed, what you need most is the things that you can't do, which is stop and sleep and rest
Mm.
and exercise and go for a walk. Um, and I remember back in the day when I'd overload myself, like we're talking about, like the contract work industry when it comes to art. Generally, actually, the numbers don't work out. They don't pay you what they need to pay you for the time you're putting in, and it just doesn't work out unless you really have a couple of unicorn, clients.
Mm.
And so what I used to do was just like I'd get to that point where I'm really really stressed, and even though I couldn't take the time off, I'd take the time off,
Mhm.
and I'd step back and I'd sleep, and I would be like, because at some point your tires start spinning, you're not actually making progress. And that's one of my biggest indicators when I was doing all of that would be like I'd get to the end of a day and I'm really no more advanced than I was at the beginning of the
Mm.
day. And so I'd stop, and my justification would be like, well, I wasn't going to get anything done anyway, so like I may as well like de-stress and go to the gym and go for a walk. And
Mm.
um, yeah,
Makes sense. It
yeah,
really does, actually. I mean, sleep is important.
sleep's immensely important.
Exercise is important.
Yeah,
Self care is important. You
it
could say.
is.
Yeah.
It is.
Do you
But
ever
it's
get
really hard.
block?
Um, no, I
That's
don't.
good.
I find that, how do I say this without offending anyone? I don't really believe in artist block. I know every time I say that, an artist block dies, but that was a terrible cook reference. But um, I think it's an emotional problem,
Right.
um, which doesn't mean that it's not a real problem, but it's an emotional problem, and you kind of got to deal with it in emotional terms.
Hmm.
So instead of trying to deal with it intellectually or anything else, essentially it just means that you're afraid of something, or you don't have direction, and so the answer is to address what those fears are,
Mm.
or realize that you don't have direction and stop doing what you're trying to do. Because most of the time you don't have direction, you're in conflict. You have a lot of resistance because you think you need to do something, but you don't actually think you need to do it. And so that's where you end up like, okay, I need to draw this thing. I really need to draw this thing. What I need to do is draw, but you don't need to draw. Like that's I don't know. There's a sense of when I have that high resistance state, what I really need to do is just try to do something else. Um, because I don't really actually, on some level, I don't believe that that's what I need to do. And yeah, yeah.
You're not alone. There are people who don't believe in block. There are people who never have block. They have
Yeah.
the opposite of block, where they have so many ideas that they can't quite pick which one they want to do first.
Well, yeah, okay. So I don't have so many ideas that I don't know which one to do. I said that I'm definitely not in that camp. But I think it's because I have a very different approach. I think I'm in neither camp because I have a different approach, and that approach is essentially if I don't, if I'm not finding, um, if I'm not finding intrigue in something, it's probably because I'm not looking close enough. I remember somebody coming up to me and be like, "Oh man, I just got a commission to paint boats. I hate boats." And they're in this state of art block because they had to paint a boat and they hate boats.
Mm,
And I remember I was just being like, yeah, I kind of get it, but there's surely you're if you're trying to approach it from one angle, then that's what you're going to come across with. But like, okay,
mm,
so I don't like boats, but I love good lighting. And
mm,
what if my good lighting happened to happen on a boat? Like I always if I get to the point where I'm not interested in something, I'm not looking at it from the right angle. Like I always am able to find something on some angle where like,
mm,
okay, so maybe let's get into the problem of the value scheme of the whole painting. Oh, now I just found something really interesting. Or maybe I get into the problem of the design of the painting. Oh, now
mhm,
there's something really interesting. Or the color, like I don't know. There's so many questions and so many things to be interested in that I think most of the time I just swap around until I find that thing. Um, and again, I think that comes back to having that feeling, that sense of intrigue or curiosity or fascination,
mm.
um, and just keep swapping the facets until you find the fascination. Terrible wordplay, but yeah, I don't know. That's where
Hmm.
my camp is. That's where I sort of generally come from. And sometimes it's just a matter of doing it until I find something really interesting about it.
Hmm.
Hmm.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Hmm. So we've talked about quite a few things, but do you have any
Yeah.
advice for people starting out in painting?
Um. Hmm. There's so much, so much advice for people starting out painting. Um. One of them, essentially, I think probably the biggest piece of advice is um, learning how to learn.
Mm,
Once you learn how to learn, then you sort of don't get worried about the setbacks.
mm,
So essentially by that I mean we only ever learn one thing at a time, and sometimes we don't even learn
mm,
that. And art's really hard because you're doing 40 things at one time, and there's a really high cost of initiation, right?
mm,
So it's kind of the idea of when you start a car, it uses more fuel for that time period than when you just run a car.
mhm,
And the same thing is true when you're trying to learn something. It's really hard
mhm,
because you're spending so much energy just trying to grasp the single idea. Um, and instead of trying to learn everything all at once, you just need to learn one thing at a time. Um, and then once you realize that your expectations on yourself, it's not that you don't expect much of yourself, but
mm,
you just this is all I need to worry about right now. This one
mm,
thing. And maybe it's not working. Maybe it's really frustrating. So just swap it out. Like, okay, I'm not ready for that. It doesn't mean that I'm not good. It just means I have other things I need to learn. And so focusing on this other thing and then gaining that skill and acquiring it until you don't have to think about it anymore. And then now you're ready for kind of the next thing, moving along. But once you realize that that's the process for everyone, for everything, all the time, then it's like, okay, it's not a problem that I don't draw like Kim Jong-gi. It's not a problem that I can't do all these amazing things, because they all went through exactly the same process. And that's all I need to do right now. I just need to worry about this one thing that I'm learning and acquiring and turning from being a mechanical skill into an intuitive skill, and just going through that process. And that's kind of all you need to worry about, one at a time. And then to make that easier, there's also a kind of a hierarchy of things that are important and things that are unimportant. When you're first starting out, the exact hues that you use don't really matter. They don't really matter. And so you kind of have to realize that not all skills are even, right? You only need one skill at a time. And if you can do some of the key skills, then you can jump really fast in how you're learning and everything. But spending excruciating, painful time on unimportant skills is really hard. So what you need to do is find somebody who knows kind of the structure of what is and is not important. And yeah, there's a functionality. Value has high function. Hue has low function. So, get really good at value, and suddenly you're free to use hue however you want to. Get really good at gesture, and accuracy will follow. There's certain things that are really good to get good at, and there's other things that just doesn't matter as much. Everything matters in the end, but in terms of there's a hierarchy of importance, and there's a hierarchy of foundational skills. So only put the pressure to do one at a time, and figure out what's actually important. And that kind of flow that you can get into with that is very motivational. As opposed to like trying to get good at something that's really not important is really unmotivational, because it doesn't impact the quality and the overall feeling of your paintings. And you get really good at this one skill that's not important, and you're just like, but I spent so much time on it, and my paintings are still rubbish. Yeah, and it's hard. It's so hard.
But ultimately worth it.
Absolutely, ultimately worth it. Absolutely.
So, Justin, how can people find out more about you and your work?
Well, they can follow me on Instagram and Twitter. You can sign up to my mailing list on my website at justindonaldsonart.com. They could email me, send me a pigeon. Yeah.
We'll have links to all this in the description below.
Perfect.
So check that out. Well, thank you, Justin.
Yeah, thank you, Angela.
Thank you, everybody, for watching. This has been Everyday Expertise. Bye.
Thanks for watching. We hope you enjoyed this interview. Be sure to share this video with friends and colleagues who may also enjoy this topic. Let us know your thoughts by leaving a comment below, or check the description for our social media. See you next time.